Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in a recent talk I discussed how the decline of Catholic education can be traced from the scientific revolution and the so-called Protestant Reformation down into the modern period. And when I say things like modern science and the scientific method were basically anti-Catholic movements, when I say things like the Protestant Reformation was the unraveling of Christian culture and the cause of the decline of education in Christian society, um, many people think I'm just making things up, like I don't have evidence for these things. But as I've explained, I've been researching classical Catholic education now for over 25 years, and I can demonstrate the truth of the assertions that I make. These are research-based, demonstrable facts from history. And what I'd like to do in this brief talk, I don't expect or plan to talk long on this. I'd like to show proof, historical, primary source evidence that proves what I say, that the scientific movement, the scientific revolution, with its philosophical foundation in the writings of Francis Bacon, and the Protestant Reformation both included a rebellion not only against Catholic theology and church authority, but against the philosophy of medieval Christian history, of Christendom in the Middle Ages. So if we were to go back into history and ask, where could we actually find proof of this? And this has been, like I said, my study for 25 years. We can go back into the time of the scientific revolution as it was developing, and into the heart of the Protestant Reformation, maybe even the climax of the spread of Protestantism. And we can find two sources that are not theology books, but address the philosophical positions that separate Catholicism from the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation. And I'd like to show you this and prove this in a video. Now, what I'm going to show you is that both the leaders of the scientific revolution and of the Protestant Reformation considered the Catholic philosophers, the scholastic philosophers, as their enemies. It was a rebellion against scholastic theology and philosophy that related to it. It was not simply a rebellion against Catholic theology or the way of salvation as the Catholic Church teaches, which is how many Protestants think about the Protestant Reformation and its relationship to Catholicism. It wasn't simply a rebellion against Catholic teaching on how to be saved. It was deeper than that and included a rejection of the philosophical foundation on which scholasticism, which is the philosophy of the Catholic Church, was based. I'm going to show you and prove that in a minute. And as for the scientific method, when we go back to the writings of Francis Bacon, we can see that the scientific method was not merely some example of the progress of human learning in the 1600s, but it was a conscious and intentional rebellion against scholastic philosophy. Now, if you're a Catholic living in the 21st century, you may not even know about these things, and you may just love the idea that Catholics invented the scientific method. And these are myths that are passed around in modern Catholic society. When we look at a modern Catholic school and we see the modern Catholic school centered around a science lab, and we see the modern Catholic curriculum ordered around modern mathematics, and we ask, how in the world did we go from classical Catholic education ordered around the 7 liberal arts, Aristotelian philosophy, and scholastic theology? How did we go from that to science and math-based schools? No one can explain it. The Catholic schools have embraced ideas that did not come from Catholic sources. And what some Catholics will do is share a list of famous scientists, they say, who happen to be Catholics. But what's funny is when we go through that list of scientists, how many of them are considered faithful, saintly, orthodox Catholics? If you go through the list, you'll find an interesting batch of people. One of those men listed among the famous Catholic scientists is a Jesuit named Gemelli, Father Gemelli. He's a famous Catholic scientist that modern Catholics point to as an example. Well, if you've ever learned about the life of Padre Pio, if you've watched the films produced, I think the one film is called Miracle Man. It's the life of Padre Pio. You'll note that in that video, in that telling of the life of Padre Pio, when he's younger, he has a nemesis. It's a blonde-haired priest who comes to investigate what's going on around him. There's a blonde-haired priest with round glasses, and he comes and visits, he's sent to visit Padre Pio. Padre Pio despises this man and refuses to even talk to him. There's a scene where this man enters and Padre Pio just walks past him and says, "Leave me in peace." He won't even talk to this man. That man in that film is Father Gemelli. He's the example that Catholics are going to point to and say, there, see, Catholics were leaders of modern scientific thinking. That's right. That's right. Some Catholics were leaders of modern scientific thinking. They were the kind of Catholics that persecuted saints like Padre Pio and were opposed by them. That's right. There are examples of modern scientific Catholics, but we have to ask the question, were they the models of Catholic thinking, of Catholic culture, of Catholic piety, or were they actually the adversaries of the saints at these different points in history? Father Gemelli is a perfect example of our lack of discernment in just listing Catholics who were active in modern science without actually learning about who they were and what their relationship was to the saints in the church. So these lists of Catholic scientists, if we're not going to study who these men were and learn the details of their lives, why offer them as examples of anything? The saints are our examples. The doctors of the church are our teachers and examples of faithful, timeless Catholicism. Just because you can string a list together of some people who happen to be Catholics doesn't mean that they're right in their thinking. And so this idea that Catholicism is the source of the scientific, nothing can be more ridiculous than that. Catholicism was the source of scholasticism. St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, the scholastics who followed St. Thomas Aquinas, they were the philosophers and wise men in medieval Catholic culture. And when we look at the writings of Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius X, we see the modern popes, late 1800s, early 1900s, we see these modern popes urging the church to return to the teachings of scholastic philosophy, to the writings of Thomas Aquinas. Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical titled On the Restoration of Christian Philosophy. Pope Pius X wrote an encyclical against the modernists. And the term modernist is misused today. That's a subject for a different talk, but these are the modernists. This is what modernism is. This is where modernism comes from. We're going to see this. So what I'd like to share with you are two primary source examples, two historical examples where it can be demonstrated that the leaders of the scientific revolution and of the Protestant Reformation were anti-Catholic, not just in their theology, not just in their ideas about how we should pursue truth using instruments and things like that, but they were rejectors of Catholic philosophy. Okay? I'm going to show you two examples, and these are two pretty significant examples, and I'll talk about each of them as we get into them. So let's take a look at two examples where we can see the anti-Catholic or anti-scholastic disposition in the leaders of the scientific revolution and in the leaders of the Protestant Reformation. I'm going to share the screen with you here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Now, I'll scroll down here for the information on this book. You can see the title of this book down here. It's On the Advancement of Learning. On the Advancement of Learning. You can see the author is Francis Bacon himself, who lived from 1561 to 1626, right in the heart of that generation of rebellion against the Catholic Church. On the Advancement of Learning by Francis Bacon, and you can see down here that this was published in 1674. That's not when it was originally published. This is a translation into English. So even the English translation was already available by 1674. Okay? On the Advancement of Learning. Now what I want to show you in this passage here on this page is the criticism of the scholastic philosophers by Francis Bacon. I'd like to pick up right here, and I'll provide a little bit of context. Right here at the bottom of the page. Now, Francis Bacon, let me switch back to my camera. Francis Bacon is called the father of the scientific method. He published a work titled The Novum Organum. And what that means is the new instrument or the new method of investigation. And as it's called new, we have to ask, what is the old? If this is new, what was the old? Well, I said it's called the Novum Organum. Organum means instrument. Aristotle's work on the art of reasoning, the categories, on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, the topics, and sophistical refutations. Those books taken together formed Aristotle's work on the art of reasoning, all together in one work. It was a complete collection of the arts of rational philosophy. All taken together, they were called the organon in Greek, which in Latin is the organum. So the original organum was the logical works of Aristotle, taken all together in one set. That was the organon. That was the instrument or the method of investigation, the method of seeking the truth Aristotle presented in his logical works in the organum in Latin. Francis Bacon's work is titled the Novum Organum, which means the new instrument or method of investigation. The name of the book is not accidental. It is a conscious rejection of Aristotelian philosophy. It is a conscious rejection of classical rational philosophy. That's what the Novum Organum is. That's what Francis Bacon is promoting, a rejection of Aristotelian philosophy, a rejection of the seven liberal arts, a rejection of scholasticism, a rejection of historic Christian philosophy. That's what's being rejected in Francis Bacon's Novum Organum. Now, in Catholic circles, the teachers of this Aristotelian philosophy, after it was demonstrated to be in agreement with Catholicism by St. Thomas Aquinas, the teachers and promoters of that Aristotelian philosophy were known as the scholastics. But they had a more casual nickname, and their nickname was the schoolmen. The schoolmen. So when you look in the writings of these 16th and 17th century authors, you're not going to find Thomas Aquinas mentioned. You're not going to find the title scholastic. What you're going to find is schoolmen. That was an English form or nickname for the scholastics, the schoolmen, those Christian scholars that existed throughout the later Middle Ages, the schoolmen, okay? Now, Francis Bacon came along in the 1600s, and he was an unjust man. He was a man who was Chancellor of England, and I've talked about him in other videos, but he was Chancellor of England. That's the same position that St. Thomas More held about a century before him. But he was actually removed from that position because he was accepting bribes. So compare Francis Bacon to Thomas More, the Catholic Thomas More, and this anti-Catholic Francis Bacon, eventually dishonored and pushed out of office because of his unjust behavior. That's the father of the scientific method. That's the man who we're going to see in this book scoffing at the schoolmen of the Catholic past. Francis Bacon hated the Catholic control of learning. He hated church authority. He hated this philosophical approach to the study of nature in scholastic or Aristotelian natural philosophy. He hated all of that, and he wanted to break free from Aristotle, break free from Catholic authority, and literally start human learning all over again. Hit the reset button. You want to talk about the Great Reset in modern affairs? This was the Great Reset. Francis Bacon proposed to his anti-Catholic peers in England in the 1600s that the English Christian men, these anti-Catholics, that they should hit the reset button and just throw out all of the historic, the classical, and medieval learning that had been developed by the classical philosophers, by the medieval saints and theologians. Get rid of all that stuff, separate ourselves from all of that, and start from scratch. Start learning from scratch and build a brand new human mind. This was the Great Reset. And so Francis Bacon proposed that philosophy not be used as the organon or instrument of learning, but that the modern scientific method be used. And there's a few things that are important. The scientific method only considers things that are material. It is a materialistic worldview. It doesn't allow for spirits, doesn't allow for souls, doesn't allow for God or any kind of spiritual influence. It is a materialistic worldview, the worldview that we see today in modern society. And if we're going to deny the existence of spirits or souls or gods, if we're going to deny their existence and consider only material things to be real or reality, then the way that we investigate this truth, the way that we build this new human knowledge is by using a new instrument. And that instrument is scientific experimentation. Not even with the senses, not with the senses, which are limited in their powers, but by means of instruments that are created by men, that allow us to see farther, more distant objects in the heavens, that allow us to see smaller, microscopic objects on earth. The world should be investigated by means of the scientific method, using physical instruments to study material subjects. And this is going to be the only admissible reality in this new human mind. This is connected to ancient philosophy in that it is Epicurean in its origins. It's materialistic. It rejects all of Platonism. It rejects Aristotelianism. It rejects Catholic scholasticism. It rejects all of the authority and tradition of the Catholic Church and seeks to establish a new truth that's established by means of the study of material things and material things alone. So this is this scientific method. This is the context of the scientific revolution. It is not pro-Catholic. It is not friendly to Catholicism. And if we simply look at the effects that it has produced through the centuries, it's very clear that this is not good for the Catholic Church or the Catholic faith. And when we look at modern schools and see them organized around science labs and math classrooms, we can see the philosophy that underlies the modern Catholic school. And don't think it's just the schools. We find the same exact philosophy underlying the modern Catholic homeschool programs. Whether they call themselves modern or whether they call themselves classical, when we look, we see science and math as the core of the curriculum. And that is modern education. That is education according to the Novum Organum. And so let's take a look here. I've given you some context, some historical and philosophical context. Let's look at what Francis Bacon has to say about the schoolmen, about the medieval Catholic philosophers, the followers of Thomas Aquinas. Let's see what he has to say about them. He criticizes them and speaks of this kind of degenerate learning. He refers to the learning of the scholastic philosophers as degenerate learning. Corrupting itself, this kind of learning reigned among, guess who? The schoolmen. The learning that Francis Bacon called degenerate was the learning of the scholastics, of the Catholic philosophers. This degenerate learning reigned among the schoolmen who, having an abundance of leisure, so because they were all idle, they had sharp and strong wits, and they had a small variety of reading. They weren't literate. The scholastic philosophers, he says, they didn't read anything. Their experience intellectually was restricted. Their wits were shut up within the writing of a few authors, chiefly Aristotle, their dictator. Their minds, he says, were shut up within the writing of a few authors, chiefly Aristotle, their dictator, just as their persons were shut up in the cells of their monasteries and colleges. So what we see here is Francis Bacon attacking not only scholastic philosophy, but attacking monastic culture and life. Just as their persons were shut up in the cells of their monasteries, so also were their minds shut up within the writing of a few authors, chiefly Aristotle, who he calls their dictator. They were all slaves of Aristotle. They didn't have knowledge of other authors. They were illiterate. They weren't smart. They were restricted to what they could study, and they possessed a degenerate learning. The scholastic philosophers, Thomas Aquinas and his followers, for the 300 years, or I should say 400 years before the time of Francis Bacon. So we see how he talks about Catholic culture. We see how he talks about Aristotle. We see how he talks about the scholastic philosophers or schoolmen, disdainfully, reproachfully, scoffing at their lack of education, their ignorance, and so on. All right? Let's keep going here. They were ignorant, he says, of the history of nature. They were ignorant of natural history, and they were ignorant of the history of time, that is chronology, or just history in general, as we use the term today. They were ignorant of natural history and of chronology. They did out of no great quantity of matter, but infinite agitation of their wit and fancy, as of the spindle, spin out unto us those laborious webs of learning which are extant in their books. So here Bacon says, if we go back and look at the writings of the schoolmen, yeah, they were bright, they were diligent, they had lots of leisure, and their leisure, which he really thinks to be idleness, allowed them to crank out all of this content, these laborious webs of learning. And what we see here is that these anti-Catholic teachers, they looked at the quantity and the complexity of the scholastic writings, and let's be honest, they're extremely difficult. Not because these monks and scholars of the Middle Ages were idle, but because they were so diligent in their writing and teaching. And when opponents of Catholic philosophy look at the mountain that needs to be climbed in order to study and learn classical Catholic philosophy, there's two options. We can humbly get to work and study, or we can scoff at that challenge and just say, look at how ridiculous this mountain of literature is, what he calls this laborious web, this useless spider web of learning, this quantity of matter, this abundance of useless, time-wasting, idle nonsense that they produce just by their clever wit in ignorance of natural history and of time. We don't need to study that stuff. Let's just get rid of this scholastic learning. And let's start fresh. None of this degenerate learning. He goes on to say, for the wit and mind of man, if it work upon matter by contemplating nature and the works of God, worketh according to the stuff and is limited thereby. But if it worketh upon itself, as the spider works his web, then it is endless, and brings forth cobwebs of learning, indeed admirable for fineness of thread and work, but of no substance and profit. This is Francis Bacon's opinion of Christian philosophy that existed before the 1600s. He compares it to a cobweb. And we can see that he's saying, oh yes, if you look at a doily that someone has stitched, it's very beautiful. All of the fine lace work and so on, it's very pretty, and you can look and admire the skill that goes into that. But what is it actually for? It's useless. It's just this idle decoration that's made by this skilled needleworker, but it's useless. In the same way, he says, the writings and works of the schoolmen, they're just all useless. It's all just this kind of subtle, cunning, idle rambling of all of these men who have nothing else to do but just turn inward on their own thoughts. They don't study nature. They don't study God himself or his works. They just talk about their own ideas, and they continually dwell on their own thoughts, and it's this constant disappearance into this black hole of useless wit and learning that has no real purpose. That's what the schoolmen provided. Pretty interesting. That's Francis Bacon's opinion of scholastic philosophy. What's interesting is that we can see that he thought that if we abandoned this scholastic philosophy and we turned our attention, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He thought that if we turn our attention to the simple and direct study of the natural world, rather than a philosophical investigation that we use to discern universal truths and then use them to understand the natural world. If we just went directly to the natural world, this would all be very easy. He thinks that science will be very simple. And we'll see that these scholastic philosophers were just idle, weavers of cobwebs. If we turn the wit and mind of man to contemplate the nature and works of God directly, we'll quickly and easily learn the truth about all things. But if we allow these schoolmen to cause us to study the works of Aristotle, to contemplate our own thoughts and arguments and reasons and demonstrations and so on, this laborious task, sorting through this mess of cobwebs of learning, we'll never make any progress. It's all just a waste of time. These schoolmen who are just slaves to their dictator, Aristotle. That's the opinion of Francis Bacon of Catholic philosophy. That's the opinion of the father of the scientific method, the author of the Novum Organum. That's his opinion of the philosophy that Pope Leo XIII and Pius X are calling to be restored in modern Christian culture. I hope that you can see, because it's been demonstrated, that the leader of the scientific revolution was anti-Catholic philosophically. It was not a Catholic-friendly movement. It is not an innocent movement. If you're a materialistic, shallow person who doesn't understand scholastic philosophy, you'll love Francis Bacon's writing. You'll love it. It'll make sense to you. If you want to go to school and just do experiments to study, what's in the soil or what's contained in a certain liquid, to study physics and chemistry in a modern classroom, and you think that that's all there is to know, you'll love this. You'll love this scientific method and all this stuff. But if you realize the questions and the issues that are completely ignored by this scientific method, if you realize that this cannot deal with God or the soul or the nature of man, which is body and soul, but is just going to reject all of that and ignore it and pay attention only to what is material, to what can be studied by means of the senses and scientific instruments, you'll love this stuff. But if you want more, you'll find the scientific method doesn't even allow that stuff exists. And I know that Christian scientists will all spin it and say, oh, no, that's not true. The scientific method is only for material things, and there are, we use our own methods for investigating philosophy and theology and questions about God and the Spirit. That's not true. That's not true. Christians can continue to say that. They can say all the right things to try to explain it away. But the truth is the learning of the schoolmen, which was theological and philosophical, which dealt with questions of the nature of God, of all of his works, of the way of salvation, of the angels, of the soul, and so on. The works of the schoolmen, which moved from those universal truths and spiritual realities and moved by means of reasoning from them down to the created world, studied the created world in light of those spiritual realities. All of that is rejected as idleness, as mere cobwebs of learning. So don't try to explain it away and pretend that this is friendly to Christian philosophy. It's not. It's not. He names the schoolmen explicitly in this work as his opponents who possess what he called degenerate learning and not real learning. So don't try to make these things friends. The scientific revolution was an anti-Catholic movement. It rejected all of the supernatural and concerned itself only with material things, suggested only one method for their investigation, and as we'll see over time, and as we'll see continually today, will insist that everyone submit to the conclusions of this materialistic philosophy. That's why when COVID comes and you're getting vaccinations and a mask stuck on your face, you're told, follow the science. There's no alternative. And we see these foreshadowings of evil that can come at any time in the name of science, because this is the true nature of this modern science. It's not innocent. It's anti-Catholic at its core. And we'll see that more and more as it works itself out in modern society. So there's an example, a demonstration of the anti-Catholic nature of teaching in the scientific method at the time of the scientific revolution in the writings of Francis Bacon in the 1600s. Okay? That's proof number one. And this isn't some obscure book by some nobody who didn't understand. This is the writing of Francis Bacon himself. Primary source proof of what I say. So much for the scientific revolution. Now let's take a look at the writing and the teachings of the Protestants. Let me pull this up real quick and make sure I've got the right spot. Yeah, I'm good. Okay, so now what about the Protestants? Let's take a look at what the Protestants have to say, because okay, you know, there are Christian brothers, right? There are brothers and sisters in Christ. They're just concerned about salvation, right? They're just worried about what they need to do to be saved, and they're concerned about, you know, collections for indulgences that free souls in purgatory. They're offended by those things. They only care about what's contained in the Bible, right? They're only concerned about Jesus and his love for us, dying for us on the cross. That's all that Protestants are concerned with, right? They read the Bible and just being innocent souls that they are, you know, kind of overwhelmed by philosophy and just interested in this humble working man's Bible religion. They're not comfortable with all of this stuff of Catholicism, right? It's just a simple, nice, innocent little religion for people worried about how to get to heaven. Well, let's go look at the writings of a Protestant. This book that I'm going to share, let me give you some background for it. Let me go over to it. This is a book titled, simply enough, Logic. Logic, or the right use of reason in the inquiry after truth. Logic, or the right use of reason in the inquiry after truth. Now, where have we heard that language before? logic, the right use of reason in the inquiry after truth. That sounds a lot like what Aristotle taught in the Organon, right? He taught that that classical reasoning contained in his work, the Organon, was the instrument to be used in the investigation of truth, in the inquiry after truth. So what in the world is a Protestant writing about? They're not interested in philosophy, right? What's a Protestant doing writing about rational philosophy? He's writing about a subject that has already been taught by Aristotle. What's going on here? Before we get into that, let's just talk about the author. You see his name is Isaac Watts. Flip over here real quick. Isaac Watts, and he lived from 1674 to 1748. 17th and first half of the 18th century. Isaac Watts was a Protestant minister. He was a doctor in the sense that he was a highly educated man, most likely went to Oxford or Cambridge. I don't know which school he went to off the top of my head. But he's living in the 1700s as a highly educated Protestant minister. And you may have heard his name before because Isaac Watts was the author of a number of well-known Protestant hymns. Hymns that we sometimes even sing in the Catholic Church, like I Sing the Mighty Power of God. That was written by Isaac Watts. He was a well-known minister. He was a hymn writer. He wrote books also for children. There's a book titled Divine and Moral Songs for Children, written by Isaac Watts in the 1700s. But what some don't know is that Isaac Watts was also the author of the textbook on logic that was used by by Protestant schools and colleges for several centuries. Isaac Watts, this same man, this Protestant minister, was the author of a logic textbook that was used in Protestant schools for centuries. Now, if you look in modern Protestant homeschool catalogs, you'll find this book advertised and they'll boast about it, how it was central in Protestant education, how it was used for several centuries in Protestant schools and colleges and so on. This is a significant Protestant textbook from history, from the early 1700s, okay? As the Protestant Reformation is really running full speed ahead in England. So what does this have to do with classical Catholic education? What does this have to do with scholastic theology? What does this have to do with the scientific revolution or anything else? Why am I talking about a logic textbook by Isaac Watts? First of all, to show you that the Protestants were not simply concerned with religion. It was not simply a movement that was worried about what we're supposed to believe about how to be saved. It was much deeper and more profound than that. It extended all the way to questions of philosophy and education, to the publication of new textbooks, not just for religion classes, but a replacement of the classical liberal arts with new textbooks that taught a new philosophy. Protestantism is not some innocent little religious pursuit of the way of salvation. It is much deeper. It extends to all areas of learning, even the art of reasoning itself. Now, let's look at this book now. We're in an early part of this book. It's page 25. Page 25 of a 365-page book. And the title, you'll see here, Section 5, of the 10 categories. Of the 10 categories. So Isaac Watts here is writing of the 10 categories. What in the world are the 10 categories? Well, if you go back to the old organon of Aristotle, and you look at the names of the books that comprise the organon, you'll see that the first book in the art of reasoning is titled The Categories. It's the first book of Aristotle's works on the art of reasoning, this second of the 7 classical liberal arts. In this book titled The Categories, Aristotle explains how the predicables, and I know that you may not know what I'm talking about. You've got to study classical reasoning with us in order to get into these things. But Aristotle teaches that if we take a subject, any subject, you can name a person, you can name any object and use it as the subject of a sentence. It's easy to understand this. But if you take a subject and then you assert something about the subject, we call that assertion the predicate. We talk about the subject and the predicate in a sentence. That's easy to understand. But the question in philosophy, in rational philosophy, is what can be said of any subject, or how many different kinds of things can be said or asked about any subject. And the philosophers worked on this to try to understand this in a scientific way so that we could gain an artistic understanding of the art of reasoning. And as the philosophers investigated this, they said, though we can say thousands of different things about a subject, if we take all of those things, we'll find that we can divide them into just 10 categories. There's just 10 different categories, and the word category, we use it today to mean different compartments or containers or classes of things. But that's not what it meant in ancient Greek. In ancient Greek, the word that category is derived from is simply the word for predicate. That's what it means. So the 10 categories are really the 10 predicates, the 10 classes of predicates, things that can be said about subjects. And Aristotle, in his rational philosophy, said there are 10 classes of things. This was taught in the categories. It was believed and maintained and taught for, let's see, Aristotle was around 330 BC. From then all the way through until the time of the scientific revolution and Protestant Reformation. 2,000 years, right? 2,000 years. The categories of Aristotle were the beginning of the art of reasoning. Classical Catholic education was centered around Aristotle's doctrine in the science and art of reasoning. Well, here we are in the early 1700s. This book was originally published in 1726. We see in 1620 Francis Bacon rejecting the learning of the schoolmen. We just saw that before. We see Francis Bacon proposing a new organon, a new instrument for the pursuit of truth. He proposes the scientific method. Here we see a Protestant not talking about the way of salvation, but talking about the art of logic, and specifically talking about the 10 categories of Aristotle. What in the world does a Protestant minister have to do with the categories of Aristotle, the first book of Aristotle's Organon? Well, let's read and see what he has to say. So let's look at this book and see what Isaac Watts has to say about the categories of Aristotle. Reading down here, section 5 of the 10 categories. He says, we have given an account of the two chief objects of our ideas, namely substances and modes, and of their various kinds. In these last sections, we have briefly comprised the greatest part of what is necessary in the famous 10 ranks of being called the 10 predicaments or categories of Aristotle. I want you to notice the Protestant ministers in the 1700s and earlier, they were aware of Aristotelian philosophy. As we see in Francis Bacon, they were all aware of scholastic philosophy. They weren't these simple, ignorant people. They weren't these humble farmers, just moms and dads trying to teach their kids how to be saved. That is not what they were. They were conscious of Aristotelian philosophy, of scholastic philosophy, and what we're going to see is both of them, the leaders of the scientific revolution and the Protestants, were both consciously rewriting the textbooks and creating an entirely new system of philosophy and teaching it in their schools in the 16 and 1700s. It was not a simple religious movement by well-intentioned people concerned about salvation. It was a thorough rebellion against medieval learning, against all classical Catholic learning and education. So here we see Isaac Watts bringing up the categories of Aristotle. Well, what does he have to say about these categories of Aristotle? He says, of the categories of Aristotle on which there are endless volumes, again, you see the scoffing attitude that we saw in Francis Bacon. There are endless volumes. Remember the cobweb of learning, formed by several of his followers, but that the reader may not utterly be ignorant of them, let him know the names, substance, quantity, quality, and so on. These are the 10 categories identified by Aristotle. Now we see the judgment. It would be a mere loss of time, a waste of time, to show how loose, how injudicious, and even ridiculous is this tenfold division of things. So here we have the judgment of Isaac Watts, a leading Protestant minister and the author of a logic textbook that rejects Aristotelian rational philosophy and establishes a new rational philosophy that becomes the textbook of Protestant schools and colleges for several hundred years. He refers to the 10 categories as being loose, injudicious, and even ridiculous. That's the Protestant opinion of the categories of Aristotle. I have now provided primary source evidence that the leaders of the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation were conscious of Aristotelian philosophy, were conscious of the writings and teachings of the so-called schoolmen, and that they consciously and intentionally rejected them and presented something new to replace them. That's what I want you to see. They rejected classical Catholic learning, classical Catholic education. They rejected them and presented something new to replace them in the 16 and 1700s. Fast forward to 2000, and what you see in the modern schools is the system of learning that started with these anti-Catholic men in the 16 and 1700s. This is where the Great Reset already took place. This is where the decline of Christian education began. This is where Christians abandoned classical Catholic learning. This is where the modern science and math-based curriculum had its origin, in this 16th and 17th and 18th century scientific and Protestant teaching. The scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation are two sides of the same coin. You can't separate them. They are united together against a common enemy, and that common enemy is scholasticism. Protestantism and the scientific revolutionaries are united in their fight against scholasticism. And when you want to understand how significant that is, go into the 18 and 1900s and see Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius X calling Christians to return to scholasticism. Return from what? Return from what? Return from this. This is where it started. It started in the writings of Francis Bacon and the leaders of the scientific revolution. It started in the writings of Protestants as they presented something new to replace Catholic culture. Now, these English scientists and Protestants, when we have the discovery and establishment of America, these people come and establish the culture, the intellectual culture in America. These are the sources of the American government. These are the sources of the American public school system. And we see these ideas work themselves out in anti-Catholic American culture that develops in the United States as the country is established in the 17th and, or I should say the 18th and 19th centuries. This is not innocent stuff. The classical Catholic curriculum was consciously and intentionally replaced by the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation. The scientific revolution is not simply interested in promoting a different approach to studying nature. It's saying that the only thing that exists is nature. There's nothing else. It calls the writings of the schoolmen cobwebs of degenerate learning. And the Protestants, they're not some innocent people just concerned about how to be saved. They're people who intentionally subverted medieval learning and established Catholic philosophy and replaced it with their own textbooks, not just in religion, in the classical liberal arts. Now, when we fast forward, and I know this is getting long, but I think it's pretty good. I think if you're with me at this point, you've enjoyed this stuff so far. When we look in the 1990s at the so-called Protestant classical education movement, we don't see a return to scholastic philosophy. We see some confused, really strange and creepy attempt to pretend that Protestant schools have some kind of ancient or classical history to them that's going to be restored in the classical education movement. No, the Protestants were the source of the decline of classical education. The Protestants were the ones teaching this new rational philosophy that would end up falling to pieces and leaving us with this modern materialistic, scientific, and what's the word that I'm thinking of? The result of all of this modern science, the word is so obvious, I can't think of it off the top of my head. Agnostic, that's the word I couldn't think of. Agnostic, where we find ourselves lost in this constantly, increasingly complex pursuit of the knowledge of the natural world. Francis Bacon told us it was going to be simple. It turns out that it just gets more and more complex. And when we look at the writings of the schoolmen in 2022, and we compare them to the actual cobwebs of learning of modern scientists and Protestants constantly writing and publishing and changing and disagreeing and splintering, constantly manufacturing confusion until the point where human beings look at each other and say, there's just no way to know anything. It leaves us with agnosticism. There was no agnosticism in the Middle Ages. There were no people walking around, saying that it's impossible to understand anything. That's a modern problem that is actually a result of these false philosophies, these false methods of investigation, which replaced and subverted the reliable, trustworthy ones that existed before them. So when the Protestants pretend like they're offended by modern science and modern society, give us a break. Modern science was your buddy in the rebellion against Catholicism. Modern science was your teammate when you worked together to subvert classical Christian learning and replace it with this modern philosophy that had never existed before. These results that we see today, you're not the ones to remedy these things. You're the causes of these things. There's no such thing as Protestant classical education. The classical learning that existed among the early Protestants was simply the residue of their Catholic past, of their Catholic education. It was only a matter of time before the scientists and the Protestants got the textbooks rewritten, reorganized the schools, got rid of the monasteries, got rid of scholastic philosophy, and established their own schools, that this decline began and continues today, with all of this chaos being produced by the scientists and the Protestants. They're not the saviors of this modern mess. They're the causes of this modern mess. And the only way that we're going to fix this is by backing up, getting back past the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation in history, restoring classical Catholic education, and starting where we left off. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, that's what we're working to do. This is not my theory of education. This is not my opinion about what would make for a better school. I can show you these things happening in history, in the writings of the scientists and the Protestants in the 17th and 18th century. I've shown you that. Primary source evidence, which supposedly everyone thinks is so important. Well, there it is. There's the evidence. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I'm very proud to say we're fighting against this mess. We're fighting against this intentional subversion of historic Christian learning. We're working to restore Christian philosophy. We're restoring the original 7 classical liberal arts from their sources. We're restoring Aristotelian rational philosophy as it's contained, not in this new organon, but in the original organon of Aristotle, where we learn the art of reasoning. We're restoring scholastic philosophy, not as a subject that someone may learn about in a seminary or a Catholic university, but as the foundation of the entire curriculum in Catholic education. And we're going back and restoring Catholic theology, scholastic theology, rooted in the classical liberal arts and in classical philosophy. This rejection of Aristotle leaves us with no Catholicism. As you'll see, you can roll your eyes and scoff at me. But remember, when you study the Summa, the Catholic doctrines that are established and demonstrated in the Summa often depend on Aristotle's philosophy for their proof. When you get rid of Aristotle, you get rid of the proof of many Catholic doctrines, and you're left in theology with what these fools are left with in natural science and religion. You're left with agnosticism. Everyone confused, no one certain, everyone looking around wondering who's going to tell us the truth, and there being no one available No one willing to step up and say, this is true, and here's the proof. Because that method of thinking in the classical liberal arts, in classical philosophy, and in scholastic theology, it's all been subverted. And you can see it here, proven from the original sources. So, if you'd like to fix this, stop playing these silly games with this fake classical education, which doesn't even understand these things. Those people talking about Dorothy Sayers in Catholic schools, Dorothy Sayers is a Protestant. They don't even understand what they're talking about. They don't know any of these things, which is why they're quoting Dorothy Sayers as a source of so-called classical education. They're just borrowing from these modern Protestants and copying their ideas over into Catholic homeschool programs and Catholic schools and calling them classical. It's that crazy. I don't know what to say. It's that crazy. How they get away with it, I have no idea. But I can show you what's wrong. I can show you that these fake classical schools and classical homeschool programs don't deal with these problems. They don't even know about them. Don't even understand the causes of the problems. They're just selling something that is different enough to make ignorant Christians think that they're solving the problems when none of them even understand the problems. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we're solving these problems. And I invite you to join us as a student learning the truth about these subjects, and also to consider, if you have the personality and the will and the gift to do it, to consider studying and training to become a tutor and help to teach these things and promote them in Catholic circles. If you're interested, get enrolled in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and get to work with us, because we have to fix these problems. This is how Christian philosophy can be restored in modern society. God bless.